in Liverpool to global success. Many would argue the reason for his dismissal wasn't even fair, but what's even more heartbreaking are the years that followed, all whilst the Beatles were the biggest stars on the planet. The Beatles went through a few personnel changes in their early years before finally arriving at the Fab Four we all know. There was Stuart Sutcliffe, who played bass before leaving to pursue an art career, and Tommy Moore and Norman Chapman, who both very briefly played drums in the band. But by the summer of 1962, the Beatles had a well-established lineup of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Pete Best. By now the Beatles were a successful group, particularly in Liverpool, where they were still often playing at the Cavern Club, and they'd also just concluded their Hamburg residency, which saw them honing their craft night after night to excited German audiences. Their success continued that summer when their manager Brian Epstein was able to sign them to EMI Records. After recording a few demos and audition tapes earlier in the year, they now had a full recording contract where George Martin would produce their music. Pete Best had played on these early demos and audition tapes, but when George Martin started to produce their music, discussions were taking place over who should play drums.
And I said to Brian Epstein, when we do the next session, I don't want to interfere with the Beatles and what you're doing with them, that's fine, but I'm going to provide the drummer.
It was quite common for session drummers to be brought in to play on recordings, and George Martin felt that Pete Best's drumming wasn't good enough to warrant not being replaced. And there was some truth to what he was saying. He wasn't the only one that felt Pete's drumming wasn't up to scratch.
We just kind of fell in love with Ringo's drumming.
Right.
Ringo was in another band, and we used to go see this other band. We said, God, that drummer's good.
Right.
And one night, Pete couldn't do it, and Ringo sat in for him, and we all just went, It was like, oh my God, what is
What do we do
happening?
now?
There was something funny going on.
Yeah.
Behind us was this powerhouse who was like taking care of the job, and we went, oh dear.
The decision was made that Pete Best would be asked to leave the group. Unsure of how to tell him, they asked Brian Epstein to fire him.
It just happened completely out the blue. Yeah. There was no, forewarning at all about it. It just was called into Brian's office. After about 3 or 4 minutes, he turned around and said, Pete, I've got bad news for you. He said, in a nutshell, the boys want you out, and they want Ringo Starr in. Mm-hmm.
What makes this even more difficult is that in many ways, Pete Best was an asset to the Beatles. He was popular with their fans, put on a good show, and was a reliable drummer and band member that helped to bring in an audience to their live shows. But so it was, the decision was made that Ringo would be the new drummer.
It was a Wednesday, and Brian called. Would you join the band? And I said, what do you mean? He said, no, really join the band. And I said, sure, yeah, when? And he said, now.
Ringo was soon accepted as one of the Beatles, receiving plenty of admiration from fans whilst having a style and personality that wasn't incompatible with any of the other members. One of the concerns about Pete Best was that he was too good looking and charming, and took the spotlight away from the group equally, having too much attention himself. So when Ringo first joined, many fans were disappointed that Pete Best had been fired.
We played the Cavern. There was a lot of fighting and shouting. Half of them hated me, half of them loved me.
There was a few people there who were shouting, Ringo never, Pete Best forever. And after about half an hour, I said, oh, bugger off or something.
With Ringo, the attention was much more evenly split, and the chemistry between the four of them worked a lot better. The Beatles continued to go from strength to strength, and after releasing their debut album, Please Please Me, in 1963, they soon became global stars, and would soon become the most successful band the world had ever seen. But for Pete Best, who was fired just before all this success, life wasn't so great.
Basically, they had a record in the English charts within a month or so of me being kicked out, and after that it became history. Everyone knows about it.
Now, what does that do to a person? What is there resentment there? Is it?
In the time immediately following his dismissal, things became difficult for Pete Best. He fell into a depression, not leaving his home to speak to anybody for weeks, knowing that there would be inevitable questions from everyone about why he got sacked. Pete, of course, at the time, didn't even know why himself. As part of his original contract with the Beatles, Brian Epstein was obligated to find him work, and offered him the position of drummer in the Mersey Beats, but Pete turned it down. He threatened legal action, claiming he was wrongfully dismissed, but Epstein argued that he was fired because he wasn't a good enough drummer, and he fulfilled his obligation of trying to find him other work. His next musical endeavour would be joining Lee Curtis and the All-Stars later that year. Despite soon becoming one of Liverpool's top bands, they were still so far behind the Beatles in terms of success. There was one night in particular when both bands were playing the same show, but there was little acknowledgement made of Pete's former job.
And it meant that as we were coming off stage, the Beatles were going on stage. But nothing was ever mentioned.
Pete later moved to the US, where he formed the Pete Best Four, which later became the Pete Best Combo. They toured North America and made some recordings for smaller labels, but they had no success. They would eventually end up releasing an album called Best of the Beatles, of course a disappointing play on words that features no actual music by the Beatles, and you think us YouTubers are guilty of clickbait. The Beatles, meanwhile, were experiencing huge global success, and starting to experiment with their own music in one of their most creative periods. Sadly though, Pete Best fell back into depression, and struggling with mental illness, at one point attempted to end his own life. From this point on, he had no further contact with the remaining Beatles, but weirdly, his mother did keep in touch. When John Lennon was looking for some medals to appear on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, he asked Pete's mother if they could borrow his army medals. Eventually, deciding to call it quits on music, he left the industry and took up work first in a bread factory and later in the civil service. As the years went by, the remaining three Beatles would offer some different opinions on why Pete Best was really fired, expressing different levels of regret. John, for example, was very harsh in his criticism of Pete, claiming that he was only in the Beatles because they needed a drummer.
By then we were pretty sick of Pete Best too, because he was a lousy drummer. He never improved, you know. And there was always this myth being built up over the years that he was great and Paul was jealous of him because he was pretty and all that crap, you know. And the reason he got in the group in the first place was because the only way we could get to Hamburg, we had to have a drummer.
Paul, despite agreeing that Ringo was the drummer they really wanted, was a bit kinder towards Pete.
Just a little bit of dissatisfaction started to creep in. We really started to think we needed the great drummer in Liverpool. And the great drummer in our eyes was this guy called Ringo Starr.
And George was the kindest of the other three, stating that whilst Ringo was the drummer they wanted, things could have been handled better with Pete.
Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have done it better. But the thing was, as history also shows, Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene, you know?
As for Pete, well, he makes no apology of the pain it caused him at the time.
They caused me a lot of hardship, grief, you know, financial embarrassment, but I persevered with my own lifestyle, and, you know, I was strong enough in character to sort of turn around and say, okay, no matter what happened in the past, let's forget about it, okay.
To be fair to the Beatles, at the time of Pete's sacking, they wouldn't have known of this immense success that was coming their way. They hadn't even recorded their first album, and just wanted to be the best band they possibly could. Nor were they experienced enough as professionals to know how to properly handle the sacking. John was the oldest at the time at 21. There is, however, a silver lining for Pete. Starting in 1995, an anthology of the Beatles' work was created, consisting of a book, documentary, and 3 double albums, including many of the recordings including Pete Best. Not only did this help to cement Pete's place in the history of the Beatles, it also brought him a handsome sum of money. He claims just under £1 million, other sources claim it was much higher.
It was great. After God knows how many years, 62 to 1990, I got some royalties from work I'd done with the Beatles.
And beyond this, Pete Best has continued his role in keeping the Beatles' legacy alive, representing his important role in those early years. To his credit, Pete Best appears to have forgiven the Beatles for what happened, and now has a healthy attitude towards life.
So there comes a time, fortunately with me, it happened fairly quickly, whereby you turn around and say, it's not about yesterday, it's about today and tomorrow. And once I got that into my head, straight road ahead.
You know, you mentioned Beatles and it's the euphoria. That is, I mean, that's the legacy they've left, you know, and whether anyone will ever top that legacy, God only knows. But it's a hell of a legacy, you know, and it's wonderful for me to have been a small part of that.
Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, please take a moment to subscribe.
The life that we once knew